Section 14 of Further Chronicles of Avonlea. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Further Chronicles of Avonlea by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 7. The Return of Hester, Part 2. 10 years slipped away thus. And then Hester died. Her illness was sudden and short, but before she died she asked me to promise that I would never marry Hugh Blair. She had not mentioned his name for years. I thought she had forgotten all about him. "Oh, dear sister, is there any need of such a promise?" I asked, weeping. "Hugh Blair does not want to marry me now. He never will again." "He has never married. He has not forgotten you," she said fiercely. "I could not rest in my grave if I thought you would disgrace your family by marrying beneath you. Promise me, Margaret." I promised. I would have promised anything in my power to make her dying pillow easier. Besides, what did it matter? I was sure that Hugh would never think of me again. She smiled when she heard me and pressed my hand. "Good little sister, that is right. You are always a good girl, Margaret, good and obedient, though a little sentimental and foolish in some ways. You are like our mother. She was always weak and loving. I took after the Merediths." She did, indeed. Even in her coffin her dark, handsome features preserved their expression of pride and determination. Somehow that last look of her dead face remained in my memory, blotting out the real affection and gentleness which her living face had almost always shown me. This distressed me, but I could not help it. I wished to think of her as kind and loving, but I could only remember the pride and coldness with which she had crushed out my new-born happiness. Yet I felt no anger or resentment towards her for what she had done. I knew she had meant it for the best, my best. It was only that she was mistaken. And then, a month after she had died, Hugh Blair came to me and asked me to be his wife. He said he had always loved me and could never love any other woman. All my old love for him reawakened. I wanted to say yes, to feel his strong arms about me and the warmth of his love enfolding and guarding me. In my weakness I yearned for his strength. But there was my promise to Hester, that promise given by her deathbed. I could not break it, and I told him so. It was the hardest thing I had ever done. He did not go away quietly this time. He pleaded and reasoned and reproached. Every word of his hurt me like a knife thrust. But I could not break my promise to the dead. If Hester had been living, I would have braved her wrath and her estrangement and gone to him. But she was dead, and I could not do it. Finally he went away in grief and anger. That was 3 weeks ago, and now I sat alone in the moonlit rose garden and wept for him. But after a time my tears dried, and a very strange feeling came over me. I felt calm and happy, as if some wonderful love and tenderness were very near me. And now comes the strange part of my story, the part which will not, I suppose, be believed. If it were not for one thing, I should hardly believe it myself. I should feel tempted to think that I had dreamed it. But because of that one thing, I know it was real. The night was very calm and still. Not a breath of wind stirred. The moonshine was the brightest I had ever seen. In the middle of the garden, where the shadow of the poplars did not fall, it was almost as bright as day. One could have read fine print. There was still a little rose glow in the west, and over the airy boughs of the tall poplars 1 or 2 large, bright stars were shining. The air was sweet with a hush of dreams, and the world was so lovely that I held my breath over its beauty. Then all at once, down at the far end of the garden, I saw a woman walking. I thought at first that it must be Mary Sloane, but as she crossed a moonlit path, I saw that it was not our old servant's stout, homely figure. This woman was tall and erect. Although no suspicion of the truth came to me, something about her reminded me of Hester. Even so had Hester liked to wander about the garden in the twilight. I had seen her thus 1,000 times. I wondered who the woman could be. Some neighbor, of course. But what a strange way for her to come! She walked up the garden slowly in the poplar shade. Now and then she stooped, as if to caress a flower, but she plucked none. Half-way up, she came out into the moonlight and walked across the plot of grass in the center of the garden. My heart gave a great throb, and I stood up. She was quite near to me now, and I saw that it was Hester. I can hardly say just what my feelings were at this moment. I know that I was not surprised. I was frightened, and yet I was not frightened. Something in me shrank back in a sickening terror, but I, the real I, was not frightened. I knew that this was my sister, and that there could be no reason why I should be frightened of her, because she loved me still, as she had always done. Further than this, I was not conscious of any coherent thought, either of wonder or attempt at reasoning. Hester paused when she came to within a few steps of me. In the moonlight I saw her face quite plainly. It wore an expression I had never before seen on it, a humble, wistful, tender look. Often in life Hester had looked lovingly, even tenderly, upon me, but always, as it were, through a mask of pride and sternness. This was gone now, and I felt nearer to her than ever before. I knew suddenly that she understood me. And then the half-conscious awe and terror some part of me had felt vanished, and I only realized that Hester was here, and that there was no terrible gulf of change between us. Hester beckoned to me and said, "Come." I stood up and followed her out of the garden. We walked side by side down our lane, under the willows and out into the road, which lay long and still in that bright, calm moonshine. I felt as if I were in a dream, moving at the bidding of a will not my own, which I could not have disputed even if I had wished to do so. But I did not wish it. I had only the feeling of a strange, boundless content. We went down the road between the growths of young fir that bordered it. I smelled their balsam as we passed, and noticed how clearly and darkly their pointed tops came out against the sky. I heard the tread of my own feet on little twigs and plants in our way, and the trail of my dress over the grass, but Hester moved noiselessly. Then we went through the avenue, that stretch of road under the apple trees that Anne Shirley, over at Avonlea, calls the White Way of Delight. It was almost dark here, and yet I could see Hester's face just as plainly as if the moon were shining on it, and whenever I looked at her she was always looking at me with that strangely gentle smile on her lips. Just as we passed out of the avenue, James Trent overtook us, driving. It seems to me that our feelings at a given moment are seldom what we would expect them to be. I simply felt annoyed that James Trent, the most notorious gossip in Newbridge, should have seen me walking with Hester. In a flash I anticipated all the annoyance of it. He would talk of the matter far and wide. But James Trent merely nodded and called out, "Howdy, Miss Margaret. Taking a moonlight stroll by yourself? Lovely night, ain't it?" Just then his horse swerved, as if startled, and broke into a gallop. They whirled around the curve of the road in an instant. I felt relieved, but puzzled. James Trent had not seen Hester. Down over the hill was Hugh Blair's place. When we came to it, Hester turned in at the gate. Then, for the first time, I understood why she had come back, and a blinding flash of joy broke over my soul. I stopped and looked at her. Her deep eyes gazed into mine, but she did not speak. We went on. Hugh's house lay before us in the moonlight, grown over by a tangle of vines. His garden was on our right, a quaint spot, full of old-fashioned flowers growing in a sort of disorderly sweetness. I trod on a bed of mint, and the spice of it floated up to me like the incense of some strange, sacred, solemn ceremonial. I felt unspeakably happy and blessed. When we came to the door, Hester said, "Knock, Margaret." I rapped gently. In a moment Hugh opened it. Then that happened by which, in after days, I was to know that this strange thing was no dream or fancy of mine. Hugh looked not at me, but past me. "Hester!" he exclaimed, with human fear and horror in his voice. He leaned against the door-post, the big, strong fellow, trembling from head to foot. "I have learned," said Hester, "that nothing matters in all God's universe except love. There is no pride where I have been, and no false ideals." Hugh and I looked into each other's eyes, wondering, and then we knew that we were alone. End of section 14.